this is actually our 30th year, believe it or not. So I've been doing this kind of work for a long time. The firm has 5 lawyers at the moment, plus 2 students and a bunch of support staff. So we tend to hover around 5 to 6 or 7 lawyers, depending on what's going on in the world. We do refugee law, immigration law, and family law. Those are the 3 main areas of our expertise. And there is an emphasis in litigation, meaning that we like getting into court and litigating on behalf of people. So that takes the form of judicial reviews, which is a way of going to court to challenge a negative decision typically. We also do admissibility hearings, so those are hearings that take place when people are being sought by immigration either because of an infraction or just trying to enter into the country. We do appeals, and we also do refugee appeal division appeals, which are appeals that refugees get in the event that they've been determined negative, and of course we do refugee claims as well. Remember, so almost 20 years ago I had a teaching position at Carleton once a year, sometimes twice, where I was teaching immigration and refugee law. And for the last, since 2012, every second year, Western offers a course in immigration and refugee law, and I teach that along with a woman named Robin Seligman, who's a prominent immigration lawyer in Toronto. So she teaches the immigration portion of the course, and I teach the refugee portion of the course. So getting out of my office and teaching about refugee law has been something, has been an interest of mine for many years, and something I quite enjoy. I thought that today, I don't intend to be very long, but I thought today what I would do is just give you all a brief summary of some of the very basic issues that some of you may wonder about. So one of the first things that people wonder about is what the difference between immigration and refugee law. And there is an important distinction. Immigration law, for the most part, is set up by countries to attract immigrants to their country. And it's a system that's engineered by the legislature of the country in order to attract a particular kind of person. So in Canada, we sometimes move between focusing on family reunification, so people that are already here that want to bring relatives over, and also we want skilled immigrants coming into the country. So often those are 2 separate categories. To give you an example, if you're trying to bring over your child that's 7 years old, obviously we don't know at 7 years old whether that child is going to have a skill that will be used in the future. So you're bringing that child over for family reunification, not for any particular skill. On the other hand, if Canada wants to attract computer technicians, then we put out the word in our legislation, rather, to attract that kind of immigrant by emphasizing skills that that kind of person might have. And Canada has been using many different systems over the last 100 years, but in particular over the last 30 or 40 years, to attract these different immigrants. Sometimes we've worked on a point system, so if you have a certain education, you have certain language skills, you have certain work skills, you accumulate certain points. If you have enough points, you can come in. And now we're moving more towards a job-based system. So not only do we want you to have points, but we want you to actually have secured a job. And we're even moving toward a system that really begins at an early age, where people come into the country as a student, they work through the student process, then they get a post-graduation work. The most successful immigrants have been people that have tended to have Canadian experience, so both in terms of education and work experience. So we've emphasized that to a much greater degree than in the past. And language skills was always something that held people back. So you'd get people, you hear about the stories of people coming into Canada with doctorate degrees, either in medicine or whatever, highly qualified people, but because of language skills they end up driving taxi cabs. So the idea is to try and prevent that kind of thing from happening, so there's a greater emphasis on language skills, work experience, and that one way to guarantee all of that from happening is to start at the education point and then move them through the system that way. So there's been a much greater emphasis on that. What I was trying to get at with the immigration is the country sets up an immigration system with an intention to attract people who are typically interested in either family reunification or have economic interests that they want to pursue in Canada. So the idea there is that the people are leaving their home countries for economic reasons or family reunification purposes. They're not leaving because of any fears in their home country. They're leaving because they want to come to Canada to pursue a better life for themselves or their family members. So the system is meant to work, at least, in a formal way. There's an application process. They submit their applications. They do so from overseas. If they're approved, then they get a paperwork that allows them to get on a plane and come to Canada with their permit. So everything is supposed to, if it works as it's supposed to, it's a system that allows the people to move through the system in a legal way, and they arrive with the paperwork, so there's no surprises. That's contrasted with refugee law in a number of very serious ways. So with refugees, first of all, most often they're not coming to Canada because they want to have a better economic situation for themselves. Their primary reason for movement is because they're fleeing persecution. So to just contrast that with the immigrant's somebody that's in the immigration class, their primary purpose for leaving their country is because they want to pursue a better life for themselves or their family, not because they're being pushed out by anybody. Contrast that with the refugee. The primary reason they're leaving their country is because they're fleeing persecution. Now, there's nothing wrong with a person who is fleeing persecution and thinks that one of the benefits of that is going to be a better life for their family. So you can have a hybrid of motivations, but the primary motivation for a refugee is that they're fleeing persecution. Now, if they're a genuine refugee, then often, but not always, they simply don't have time to get documentation. They simply don't have time to apply for a passport. And I'm about to write an article about this Khashoggi case, but one of the principles in refugee law that sometimes comes up is a person who applied for a passport, maybe they applied for a passport a week or two before they left their country in order to flee, maybe they applied for a passport after they came to Canada. And the law in that area is that the board can draw negative inference from a person that applies for a passport, and the idea is it's like a turning to the jurisdiction of the person's country when you go to the embassy. And I typically used to argue, come on, how much problem can there really be? But the Khashoggi case demonstrates very clearly how dangerous it can be for somebody that does have a reason to fear persecution to actually go to the embassy, or a consulate in that case, and apply for documentation. In that case, it cost him his life. So it's not uncommon that refugees come to Canada without proper documentation, and one of the reasons for that is because if they actually went to the embassy and applied for documentation, they might actually risk their lives. And this is built into the legislation. There is no offense, criminal or immigration offense, for a refugee who's genuine to come into Canada using false documents, whereas there would be an offense for, let's say, an immigrant that was caught using false documentation. So one of the major distinctions between refugee and immigration law is that entry is often illegal. So people often enter the country either recently, one of the reasons why the refugee system is so bogged down is because people have been walking across the border from the United States into Quebec or Ontario, but often they arrive by air, and they've arrived either on a false document or on a false visa. So often illegal entry. I've talked to you about the motivation differences, people seeking refuge rather than coming to Canada for leisure or economic reasons. And in the case of refugees, another very, very important distinction is that the definition of a convention refugee, which is a term of art, so it's capital C, convention, it's the 1951 United Nations Convention that defines who is or who isn't a refugee. Canada has actually adopted the United Nations definition of a refugee into our legislation. So while there is domestic legislation that deals with refugees, the origins of the legislation are international. And so to some degree, when we sign on and ratify the convention, we do give up some of our sovereignty, because people that have come to our borders and make a refugee claim, we're now obliged to hear that case. And the definition is through the United Nations that we've adopted their definition. And that's very different than with immigration law, where it's completely domestic. How we define immigrants is completely based on how we decide to define it, who we're looking to attract, what kinds of things we emphasize, education, language skills, etc., etc. So that's another really important distinction between the two. The last one is that, and this is an important one, because it plays into the kind of chaos that exists often in immigration. With the immigration system, particularly in the last 5 or 6 years, immigration is trying desperately to control the flow. And so we are now creating caps where if we're only offering a certain number of positions for a particular profession, and then when they're filled, then we cap it and move on to the next year, basically conceding that we're incapable of processing beyond a certain number of applications each year. And so, again, we can control, to a certain degree, immigration. We can determine approximately how many immigrants we want to allow in any given year, and then we can assign an appropriate number of workers to process those applications. So there's a way to make that happen in an organized way, and so there shouldn't be lineups in theory. And one of the ways they've gotten rid of the lineups is by, like I said, saying, okay, we've reached our caps, so there's no more applications for this year for this profession, come back next year. So that at least stops people from waiting in line. Before that system, we had people waiting in line for 8-9 years to have their applications processed. In the case of refugee law, it's the opposite. There is no order. So we can't predict ahead of time how many refugees show up at our border, and it's very much dependent on international situations. So sometimes it's dependent on a situation in a country like Yemen, where there's civil war raging, and that will produce refugees. But in other instances, particularly where we have a neighbor like the United States, we cannot predict what the Americans do on a particular day. And we certainly couldn't predict the Trump. So with the Americans, often we are, particularly with Trump, because his immigration policies have been so restrictive, we have been reacting to that. So, for example, if Trump pulls off TPS status, temporary protected status for a certain country, then you can expect, he did that for Haitians, for example, so then you can expect that all of a sudden you're going to see an influx of people from that country. And the same thing for Yemen, as he started to target that country, then you start to see Yemenis coming across the border. So it doesn't always, the factors that impact who shows up at our borders sometimes has to do with the country in question, but also sometimes has to do with other countries and how they're dealing with refugees. There's another important distinction for refugees, and that is between those that make claims abroad and those that are coming into the country. So it's very, very different systems for the two. My firm deals almost exclusively with people that come to Canada and make their refugee claims inside Canada or at the port of entry. This is a very different system. When people make those claims, first of all, they're entitled to constitutional protections. So that means that, as an example, they're entitled to a lawyer at their hearing. They're entitled to an oral hearing. And those are protections that they wouldn't gain if they were abroad. The people that are making claims in Canada, so when I say in Canada, I mean either at the port of entry or inland, are entitled to a hearing before the tribunal at the Refugee Protection Division of that board. And that's what I do. I go to the board and I represent these refugees at the board as an advocate on behalf of the refugees, and they're determined by members of the Refugee Protection Division, and those members determine whether the person meets the definition. If they do, then they're allowed to remain in the country and they're allowed to apply for permanent residence status. If they fail, then they go through the failure system, which could eventually lead to their removal from the country. On the other hand, there are programs available for people that are abroad. So, of course, one of the problems for any refugee is, how do you get to Canada? If you're applying for a visitor visa, as an example, the officer has to determine whether the person is coming to Canada for a temporary purpose. So I often get this question from people abroad, which is, I want to come to Canada and make a refugee claim. Can I get a visitor visa, or can you help me get a visitor visa so I can come into Canada and make a refugee claim? And the answer I have to give is, of course, I can't assist you with that, because if you're telling me that your purpose for coming into Canada is a permanent one, you want to stay here permanently because of a fear of persecution, then you can't apply for a visitor visa where you're going to be representing to immigration that you're coming to Canada for a temporary purpose. So people abroad are in a bit of a dilemma.